Okay, yeah, so I'm Paul Hallows. I'll give you a quick introduction of my studio. I'm a graphic designer, illustrator. I tend to have a go at most things. I do some education as well, and so I'm very much like a have a go at most things. I have an art practice, and the art practice is making patterns out of infrastructure. And so I'm going to split the talk into like 3 parts. There'll be just an example of what I do. My practice 1.0, which is where I learn all my rules from and what I'm going to do next. And then patterns practice 2.0, which is where I've enforced these rules on myself, these constraints, how to make the patterns better. Because there was something I found unsatisfactory about my first practice. I enjoyed the process of learning about it, but then it was like time to knuckle down and sort of work out what actually did work. So, what do? I focus mainly on infrastructure, and the idea is that I like to take a tile, and it's one scene, and sort of show people the extent of how infrastructure works. So I sort of describe this as my bike ride to the studio. I'll cycle down a road, and I'll see tower cranes. I live in Manchester, so it's a nearly constantly developing city. I'll turn another street, and I'll see more tower cranes. Then I'll see more tower cranes. I live in Salford, work in Salford, so my journey to Manchester is constantly filled with like developments. And then I think about the rest of Manchester, and there is a lot of development going on. And then I think about how long I've lived in Manchester and all these developments that keep happening. And I just want to reveal to people the sort of like use of infrastructure and how insane it is how much we actually make and how much we fabricate as human beings and how much we sort of like build. And a lot of this is sort of ties into climate change as well, because if you really think about the extent of these things. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about ways of seeing how it's sort of changed my views of like how I look at the world. I think if you have an art practice, you tend to reevaluate the world around you. You have like a lens to look at things with. And so now, for example, my journey today, I went to Piccadilly train station, which has become a pattern. Like, I think about how many trains leave a station, I think how many people commute, how many people are carried. And then I start to think about, I'll turn the microphone off. Is that okay? Oh, sorry. I think about how many journeys happen every day and how much we use this infrastructure and how important it is to the UK as well. Is it better to do that? Yeah, it probably isn't. So I get really enthusiastic about infrastructure. And then I think about shipping containers. Like this is from Google Earth, but it's a place near my studio. It's Trafford Park. And there's all these containers there. And then I start to think about what these shipping containers carry, how often they travel around the world, how frequent they are. And it's like millions of them as well, sort of in transit all the time. And they're constantly moving. When the Evergreen container ship was sort of banked, we really fundamentally understood how important these things are and how much we actually rely on them. And then also things like, I'm from Manchester, which has a terrible climate, but even in Manchester we have air conditioning units for like restaurants and stuff. And again, I think about how conditioned lives we have to have in certain parts of the world and how much energy we draw. And then we get to thinking about how to make a pattern out of the air conditioning units as well. And at that point, you start to really think about how much infrastructure and how much we rely on these sort of systems. So I'm going to go to my notes because I do tend to waffle quite a lot and then get sidetracked. In fact, I'm just going to freeform it. Why not? So being able to see our systems as just a repetition and being a little overwhelmed by it can help us imagine the consequence of these systems. And I think that sometimes we always treat a system we encounter as like an individual act. It is just us, the individual, going throughout our day-to-day lives and interacting with infrastructure on like a one-to-one basis. But we're all sort of doing this. And if we all thought about how much we rely on this infrastructure and how our repetitions in that occur, then we start to think about the bigger consequences of that. And that can be climate change. It can be like positive consequences. The more we use like wind turbines, for example, there's a bigger market for it. And we can start having cleaner energy. But then we also think about the opposite, like more air conditioning units means more energy used, more coal power stations turn on in certain parts of the world. And so I want to go back to where it started. I didn't really think about these patterns. I was obsessed with infrastructure, but didn't really think about the consequences or the repetition of it. And so I went to Jesolo Beach in northern Italy, which is sort of like Italy's Blackpool, if that makes any sense. And so what it was like these regimented rows of parasols. And I realized it was a factory for sunbathing. And it was off-season, so it felt really haunted at the time. But I was just obsessed with this idea of like a grid of parasols. Like the idea of going on holiday and relaxing is now formalized into a factory setting. Here's an aerial view I saw later, and it really is like this sort of very regimented row. I think it's Andreas Gursky's done photography, and this is one of the parts he does do as well. And then we're going to zoom out even further, and look at that. Like, that's astounding, isn't it? How much like people live in this factory-like setting as people in a built world. And so the first actual pattern I did was more, not me thinking about infrastructure and its use and the climate impacts, but more about a satisfaction point of view, seeing something I saw in the world and realizing it could be made into a pattern. And so my first iteration of a shipping container pattern was this one, which I was quite happy with at the time. And it was sort of my exploration. I was sort of thinking about, visually satisfying things I'd see in the world. And so I went on to think about maybe subjects that people didn't really care about. Like I've worked in warehouses in my life, I've worked in building sites, stuff like that. I love anything to do with like energy infrastructure. So these pylons that are near Cheltenham in Manchester, there's these like concrete pylons that carry electricity. This is a high bay warehouse in Trafford Park, which is zero interest to most people, except for me when I see something like this. And I'm like, look at that repetition. It's like 80 foot high, it's insane. And then I think about cardboard bales in recycling. Again, very little interest to most people, but I find it deeply interesting to see stacks of these things just lined up. And so all these patterns led to the Modernist Gallery in Manchester being interested, and they wanted to, they quite enjoyed the process, and they wanted to sort of support that. So they gave me an exhibition. And from this exhibition, I did learn the rules. This was the idea of first of all, the way I was making patterns was I wasn't making a true repetition. I was sort of overlapping elements manually in Photoshop. So I'd hand draw the illustration, then I'd overlap it, and that's how I sort of made the pattern, which limits how big I can make a pattern, and it also limits how big I can print it as well. So I was sort of relying on this is 2A0 size on the left-hand side, and that's the biggest I can possibly print one of these digital patterns. Everything else was sort of A1 in size. And so I was really happy with the outcome, but I was also a little bit I really care about people caring about infrastructure and its extent. And I think that at the size of A1, you sort of lose that repetition, you lose that scale. You aren't overwhelmed by something. And so then I set myself a series of rules, and the rules came mainly after my first attempt at Jasolo Beach. This was an A1 print, and I tried to cram in so much information. And the thing is with cramming in information is it gets lost all the time. And secondly, there's sort of a lot of detail. And I'm a hand-drawn illustrator. I want people to pay attention to the illustration. I want them to really think about it and think about what scene is being set. And so with this pattern, I was just a bit everything's lost. And I suddenly felt really disappointed in the patterns I was making. And at that point, I was I need to change this, because even if you zoom in, there's just something lost in the way the patterns are made. And so I set myself some rules, and these rules applied in my pattern practice 2.0. So I use a risograph printer, and the idea was they will repeat these tiles. And so if a tile repeats, it means I can think about a giant scale at that point. So I set some rules, and one of them is each tile should create a scene that appears rooted in reality within the confines of an A4 rectangle. That's quite a practical application, but the idea was that I want someone to pick up a tile and be I can understand what's going on, I can see that scene, and I can see something in my own life that I can see around me. And so we'll start with something like wind turbines out in the sea, and I feel having one, we can picture sort of one thing, but we can't really picture the extent of it. So I like the idea of making one tile, and then even if you expand it out to two tiles, you can sort of, you still don't see the seam, you still don't see this repetition. This idea of one scene is what we think about, and I want the boundaries of that repetition to be blurred. And so this really was a change in how it works, because the rules sort of then made me think about the maths of how it works, and made me think about the constructs of the patterns as well. And so previously I sort of just overlapped things, but at this point now I have to make every scene work within an A4 rectangle. So with tower cranes, for example, I want the tower cranes to tower. I want them to be massive. When people see them, I want them to feel like a physical object rooted in reality, rooted in physics, really. And so to do that, I've had to do this immense amount of snaking of the work to make it happen. So as you can see, the tower does tower, but it's really having to wrap around a tile in order to do this. But I really believe that every tile should communicate an idea. It should communicate something we have reality with, and not feel there's a distortion that takes people out the scene or makes them realize that, there's something uncanny or wrong about this. Which led then to the second rule, which is there is an aesthetic requirement to the pattern. So I'm an illustrator. I want people to understand a message the minute I say it. I want to be able to draw something and not hide anything from people. They look at the scene and go I understand what's going on. I can understand, I've seen that before. Even if it's something a little bit unfamiliar, at least it's rooted in sort of a framework where you're not trying to work it out too much. And so, the classic of the meal deal sandwich as well, cold mayonnaise sandwiches, delicious. And so, again, I want people to see something, not have a hidden message, to understand the thing that's going on immediately. And this also applies to the risograph printer. When I was digitally printing, what would happen is it would get like sort of dull and quite blurred, and what I wanted to translate from the screen to print would be lost. The risograph printer prints in almost fluorescent colors, which doesn't allow me to sort of make beiges and stuff like that. I can't make a dull world then. And it means that every sort of element to a pattern is highlighted. It has importance. It says, look, you know, you're meant to really pay attention. Now, I'll get to the third rule, and the assembly of the patterns is part of the artwork as well. And so even within this, like digitally printing a piece of work and send it off to print, I lose some sort of connection with it, and I lose some sort of idea of, you know, I finish the thing, then it goes off, and then the repetition's sort of done. By hand putting together the tiles, so I print them off, I have a big stack of these prints, I have to trim off certain edges, guillotine them down to make an A4 tile. I become part of the process of repetition. Like, I have to sit there, I have to cut everyone up, I have to join them all together to make bigger patterns. I mean, it's really boring work, and it's actually not that enjoyable, but it's part of the practice, and I quite enjoy the fact that it is mechanical, it is really sort of like, it slows me down, it makes me think, it makes me go through this. If I make a pattern, I have to really commit to it, I have to really care that I want to actually physically put into something in a bigger shape. And there's me sort of sticking them together as well, and it's finding ways of finding space to do this, how to plan to do this, have the budget to make a pattern this big. All these things I have to consider then. And I've gone now from making these A1 size prints, which sort of mask what I'm trying to do, to now thinking much bigger terms, like what sort of space can I use? Which goes to rule number 4, the amount of repetition in and the scale of the final piece matters. Because with the A1 prints, my biggest worry is that people see the print and not have that sense of vertigo that we should really have from infrastructure, from, you know, what we use in the world and its impact. Which means that now I can sort of start thinking in much bigger terms. This was at Altogether Otherwise in Manchester, and this is a 2 meter by 3 meter size pattern. And the idea is that when people came in to view these, they'd turn up, and you could stand close, and you can sort of, your entire periphery is filled by this infrastructure. We can see one scene. But the minute we step back, we start seeing more of it. But I really want to fill people's field of vision. The fact this was the biggest space is great. I'd love to have a much bigger space to make these patterns. I really want to do something which just off on a tangent, there's a DJ who tours Europe, and he has like these Vanta Black painted screens in his set. And apparently have like spare paint because the people who install these screens will suddenly forget that they're next to something which is Vanta Black. They'll lose all sense of like, you know, where they are. Have everyone seen Vanta Black, by the way? It's like the blackest black, like literally, it's imperceivable. And so roadies will walk into these things all the time and like scrape the paint off because they get vertigo from seeing it. And I love the idea of that. Like, if your work can make someone physically fall over, wow, incredible. So that's what I want to do next. And so Altogether Otherwise was a great test of this. And so having this work be so huge and really sort of make people think about, like, this is our impact on the planet. This is the infrastructure that we use. This is, you know, everything we do, every light bulb we turn on, like every sandwich we buy, all these things have a physical material impact and an energy impact as well. And so, yeah, it was a great space to test this out. And this sort of made me, I think at this point in my practice, I realized I was actually satisfied with the patterns I was making. I went from the patterns I was first making, which was sort of like unsatisfactory for myself, to then setting these rules and seeing these rules in application made me realize, like, actually constraints in the practice are really important. And so, whereas the algorithm in this, it's probably in my head. And the idea that I give myself these constraints, these barriers that I can't fight against, have to fit to this A4. It has to repeat, it has to do all these things. It's just a really great space to sort of work in. And then finally, I've realized we've gone through that really quickly. I know we're going to get lunch very soon. Going back to Giussolo, I actually managed to do a pattern I actually quite liked. So the first one, I absolutely hated it. But then by the time I had this new practice, I was able to replicate Giussolo in different terms. I was able to have this thing that had a sense of detail and a sense of, like, this is what you're looking at. To then be able to scale out and see, like, the whole thing and be like, yes, this is really weird that we live in these systems. Thank you. How long is that?
Thank you very much, Paul. And we are a bit over time, so we might have time for only one question. And of course, there is always
ask me anything at lunchtime, by the way. I realize I talk very fast.
Exactly. There is always time to discuss over lunch.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
When you look at the individual tiles, it's sort of hidden the fact that they're going to repeat, and I wondered if you have Like what tricks you use to make that happen?
So yeah, in fact, let's go back to a couple if we can. Probably a good example would be maybe the tower cranes, to be fair. If I just play this one. So like with this one, part of it is like working on different lines and tangents. So if these tower cranes went from top to bottom, what I do is if you can see the tower cranes disappear behind buildings, and that's my way of hiding this sort of like, there's no bottom to these tower cranes. If they were top to bottom, you'd see immediately on one A4 page, there's a tower crane, there's its struts, and there's a building below it, and you'd see the illusion. Whereas I try to plan these tiles over several different tiles. So with the tower cranes, my idea is that the tiles should sort of like go across maybe 6 different tiles. It's meant to make the viewer follow the tower crane rather than look for the seam in the paper. So mainly it's putting things at an angle is probably my solution to it.
Thank you.
There's some announcements over here.
Yes. So one more round of applause for Paul and Ivan.